Donald Trump has signaled another bold move by his administration to reshape global trade. Trump's take on Make America Great Again. This time, the focus is on pharmaceuticals. Trump hinted that significant tariffs on imported drugs could be on the way, a strategy aimed at nudging drug manufacturers to move their operations to the United States and boost American production. Now, this isn't just political bluster. The policy could soon send ripples across the global drug trade, with India, the world's pharmaceutical powerhouse, feeling the impact, or will it? Currently, India holds about 20% of the global market share for drugs. In the fiscal year 2023-2024 alone, Indian companies exported nearly $9.7 billion in pharmaceuticals to the United States market, with the US relying on India for roughly 45% of its generic drugs and 15% of its biosimilars, and nearly half of Indian drug makers, and their revenue coming from American sales. The stakes are incredibly high. The proposed tariffs are a double-edged sword. For Indian pharma companies, higher production costs and reduced price competitiveness are looming. Meanwhile, United States consumer might soon notice that their once low-cost generic drugs are getting pricier. Analysts estimate about a 12% increase per pill, which could add to around $42 a year. Such as certain cancer drugs, the cost hike could be as steep as $10,000 annually. The deep ties between Indian drugs and the United States healthcare system runs even deeper when you consider prescription trends. A significant portion of the medications in areas like mental health, hypertension, high cholesterol, digestive health, nervous system disorders, and diabetes are supplied by Indian companies. With these potential disruptions looming, a key question arises: will India be forced to reconsider its own tariff policies on United States pharmaceutical imports? Currently, India imports around $800 million worth of drugs from the United States and keeps tariffs low, between 5 to 10%. Any changes here could set off balancing act for policymakers on both sides of the aisle. What does this really mean? How is India looking at this, and what does it really mean for international trade, the global world? I'm being joined by David Sofair, who's a Republican strategist, Kenneth Moch, who's a BioPharma Sector Expert, Dharmesh Shah joins us, who's a chairman for BDR Pharma, as well as Dr. Sudhir Mehta, who's a chairman and MD for Pinnacle Industries. Thank you very much, all four of you, for joining me. Well, let me first start straight with you, Mr. Dharmesh Shah. My first question: what do you make out of this? When Donald Trump says that the pharma sector tariff is going to be hiked, or there's going to be an increase, how do you look at this? What do you make out of it?
To be honest, I don't think Indian pharma industry need to be worried about, because the generic business and the pricing in the US is all-time low. It's a very competitive market already, and which has helped US in order to keep their healthcare bill down. Everybody knows today that generic game depends solely on a backward integration, and that's where I think India is very, very strong, that we have very nice capacities in terms of the backward integration of self-reliance, API manufacturing and formulation. Our overhead costs are reasonably lower compared to the Western countries. And I believe that India has played a significant role in reducing the healthcare bill in the United States. We all know that in the US, for a generic industry where there are no API producers, significant API production, ultimately, they have to depend on the API production either from India or China, and there's a limited value addition in terms of the manufacturing of finished dosage, where the overhead cost plays a major role. So I don't believe that Indian pharma industry has major to worry about, because I believe that some or other way, the market largely depends on India and its regulatory expertise and its backward integration.
So, are you then saying that this is largely going to be a self-goal? I'm asking you this question because aren't the people living in United States going to be at the receiving end of it all?
Absolutely. Absolutely. As I told you, that the impact on Indian pharma industry is going to be minimal, considering that in some or other shape, India has a contribution in this business in US, and especially in keeping a very reasonable healthcare cost. If the tariffs goes up, naturally, again, the dependence on the API is going to be there from India, correct? And that's where India has a very strong hold. Second important thing, the overhead cost in US is significantly higher compared to that of India. Third, considering a large share of Indian generic players in a US market, overnight, the domestic producers cannot replicate and get the ANDAs approved. So there is going to be a gestation time. And this all will lead to ultimately a patient in US paying a higher cost. And I'm sure this is not going to benefit anybody.
Well, in fact, let me just get in Kenneth Moch at this point. Good evening, Mr. Kenneth Moch. Thank you very much for joining us. Here's a question, and it's almost the same thing because you are in the United States. What's your perspective? How are you looking at this as a sectoral player when you are seeing what Donald Trump is saying about the pharma industry now going to be seeing the maximum tariff hikes from the United States to the rest of the world? How are you looking at this?
Well, there are a couple of different parameters to look at. First off, costs are likely to increase when you put tariffs on anything. In the pharmaceutical industry, there's not easy substitution. There are many generic manufacturers, but not that many, so prices will go up. Manufacturing in the pharmaceutical business doesn't move that quickly because it's a very regulated industry. So the idea here is that manufacturing will come back to the United States. Pharmaceutical manufacturing is not something that can be easily transferred, so we'll have to see how that evolves. The other side of this, and I think it's something that's difficult but important to consider, is that the supply chain in the United States for many of these drugs has moved outside of the country, and this is, I think, the concern that the Trump administration is dealing with, that the supply chain being outside the United States leaves us vulnerable in certain complex situations like another pandemic. So it's just not an easy answer. I don't particularly like tariffs, but my voice doesn't count here. I do think it does raise prices, and without alternatives, either it's passed on to the consumers or it's absorbed by the companies or a combination of that.
That's interesting. David Sofair, do you want to come in at this point? You just heard two voices, one from India, one from the United States. And both of them are extremely skeptical about what Donald Trump is trying to do, particularly with the pharma sector. If you're trying to get in all manufacturing in the United States, pharmaceuticals may not be the way to go forward the way it is getting handled by Donald Trump and his administration.
Good evening, Sneha, and thank you very much for having me. It is important not to rush to judgment because we do not know what the actual tariffs are in respect to pharmaceuticals, and we don't know exactly what countries are going to yet. Mr. Shah made a good point about how he doesn't feel like there would be an immediate effect on the generic pharmaceuticals in India, and your second panelist also made a very good point about how it takes a long time to really get that supply chain up and running in the United States. We had a very, very tough time sourcing medicine during the pandemic. We're heavily reliant on China, during that time for meds and all types of medicines here in the United States. Now, we are leveling the playing field with China, so the tariff war with them could escalate. They've been very bad actors when it comes to supply chain, when it comes to global trade. etc. So I would look to really focus on them. Now, if you want to set up in the United States, that's going to take, like your other panelists were saying, a significant amount of time. So we'll have to see what and where the specific tariffs will unfold. So let's really wait and see.
Okay. Okay, if that's what you're saying, I have one more question, but let me just introduce Maruf Raza at this point. Good evening, Mr. Raza. Thank you so much for joining us. Allow me 2 minutes. I want to ask David Sofair one question before I come to you for a counter on that. David Sofair, to just carry on what you're saying, are you then essentially, do you suspect that this is more of a political messaging about optics rather than what Donald Trump has done with tariffs in other sectors?
No, I don't think it's optics at all. I think that there will be some sort of tariff against pharmaceuticals. I mean, I think that is, but it's important to, we don't know where they will be at and at what country it will be primarily focused on, So I don't want to speculate, but we could, I think that, China could really be the target here.
All right, I'm being joined by Maruf Raza. Maruf Raza, good evening. David Sofair and others are just talking about how they are looking at the entire gamut of how these tariffs are playing out, particularly with the pharmaceutical industry for that matter. I believe we have some issues with the connectivity. We'll try and fix that and then return to you, Mr. Raza. But Dr. Sudhir Mehta, my question to you, how do you look at it? You are obviously coming from a sector which is not pharmaceuticals. But the way United States has gone about doing what it is, the attempt of the Trump administration to make America great again has signaled bad for world. We've seen the markets literally boomerang the way it is. There seems to be a lot of pessimism. How do you look at this?
So good evening. I think if you had even written a science fiction movie a week ago, and in that movie, you had two things happening. One was that India would probably be the country with the US with the single lowest tariff, which it is today when you compare it to the 10 largest economies. And secondly, you probably would be looking at a situation where people from the US or relatives from the US would be coming in with a suitcase and shopping in India and going back because they'd be able to pay for the cost of the trip by buying iPhones or clothes in India. So I think both of these are scenarios which are now playing out. First and foremost, I think it's very early days. We are having mayhem in the markets, and probably it's too early to say what is happening, what will happen in each sector. To put the pharma sector in perspective, it's, as you mentioned, it's an export of about 10 billion. And most of these pharma medicines are actually generic. So even if the duty is increased, the choice would be, can there be an alternative? And in the short to medium, and I would even argue long term, there is no alternative because the cost of making these in the US, which would take at least a couple of years, and even after that, even with the duties, probably it would be cheaper to make in a country like India, which now has deep expertise in these kind of generic and other medicines, which are much, much lower in cost. And even if the duty is added on, that's probably still the cheapest life-saving drug that would be available. So to answer your question, I don't think India pharma has much to worry about in the short to medium term. It is going to cause a lot of turmoil. It will mean that for a few months, all shipments are messed up because at the moment, nobody knows whether they should be sending further shipments. The duties are changing by the day. But let's remember that India is possibly not the largest target of what's happening in the world. Clearly, within a week, as I mentioned, you have a situation where if you look at the tariff, China is now at 104%, Mexico is 25%, Vietnam is 46%.
That's right.
And the only country lower than India in that sense is the United Kingdom from the major one, which is at 10%. So comparatively, the focus at the moment, at least, is not India. It's clearly China. And I think the Indian government is doing the right thing by keeping quiet, letting this kind of work itself out. There is no sense in having any immediate reaction, and any immediate reaction will only mean that things get worse. So I would wait for some time and let this kind of work itself out. But to answer your question, I don't think India in the pharma sector has much to be worried about short to medium term.
Okay. In fact, Mr. Shah, if you could come in at this point, just to give a perspective to our viewers as well. We just have some numbers with us. If you look at India's pharma imports from United States, it's around $800 million. But if you look at the kind of tariffs, it's 5 to 10% that India levies tariffs on US pharma products. Now, if you look at this, this isn't extremely high when you compare it to other sectors as well. But could you give us a sense of just how much is the reliance? I mean, we have the numbers, we have it up on our screen, but to break it down for an average Indian, what's the kind of reliance on Indian pharmaceuticals when it comes to United States?
I would say there is a large dependence, either in terms of the finished dosage or in terms of the raw materials which have been exported to different parts of the world. And those players are making a finished formulation and catering to the US hospital and US patient. So I would say directly as a generic finished formulation and indirect with an API from India, there is a large dependence. I would say much more than even 55, 60% dependence, whether you call direct or indirect dependence.
Okay, that's an interesting thing. Then who do you say would be the biggest losers in this particular case? If these tariffs do come into play, particularly with the pharma industry, who would be the biggest losers?
The patients, the people of the United States, they will end up paying a high cost if the tariff goes up.
David Sofair, do you want to take that? You just heard.
Yes,
I mean, everybody
quite
believes
agree.
the biggest
I
losers
quite agree.
will be people in the United States.
It is the patients. You know, absolutely, it is the patients. America is already paying the highest cost ever that in respect to generic drugs or not. It doesn't matter. I mean, here it's an unbelievable amount. You know, so yes, it will be the patients. However, you know, it's very important to see how this unfolds. Again, in respect to India now, they have a tariff on us of, what was it, 8%? So, you know, they could eliminate that tariff or reduce it.
It's 5 to 10%.
Significantly. Yeah, 5 to 10%. So they could reduce that or whatever. So that's the margin. So that's the risk. So I don't see this being a big thing for India. It could affect the American consumer, but ultimately it could benefit the consumer as well in the long term as we look to streamline things like the FDA, like regulation, like the insurance companies and the middlemen that make billions of dollars. Over like 25% of American GDP actually goes to healthcare, and that's all fees. So, you know, it could be over a long time, you know, a good thing. So, you know, we have to see how it unfolds as we make America healthy again.
David Sofair, and you know, I just want you to answer this as well as Dr. Sudhir Mehta. David Sofair, to you first.
Please.
Obviously, Donald Trump is known to be a person who will not cut short or stop short of what really he wants to speak. So the words that he would use is quite out open in there, including what he said recently about, you know, how countries are responding to them. Kiss my, whatever he said, I can't say that on air. Basically implying that countries are now trying to haggle and trying to get the benefits with United States by lowering their tariffs or whatsoever, whatever he believes. My question really is this going to make America great again with the kind of a turmoil that's literally at the face of countries, worlds, globally? Is this really going to make America great again? I mean, if the focus is getting manufacturing back in the United States, jobs back in the United States, I don't think America can be insulated from what's happening from the rest of the world.
I don't think it can be as well. But in the meantime, we're making America come to an even playing field with bad actors like China, who had a hall pass for a very, very long time. So let's just make sure and be clear here that they have not honored any of their commitments from a global trading perspective. Okay, when they entered the all of these engagements. So we're coming after countries such as China, and President Xi should get on a plane and go see Trump and make the playing field even again. So, we're holding the bad actors in the world accountable. Yes, there are tariffs; they're unpopular. The market hates uncertainty, and we are suffering through inflation, and the stock market has been there's been trillions
You are
off the
saying you're
table.
suffering through inflation. Donald Trump says there is no inflation.
Well, there is inflation at the moment. Sure, there's inflation at the
Okay.
moment. Sure, there is. I mean, it's reduced, but I think it's in the
Okay, Dr.
States it's at
Sudhir, how do you look at this? I mean,
2.5%.
as somebody who's looking at all of this very closely, you just heard David Sofair as well speak. Sure, US is trying to checkmate China. It very clearly seems visible that the tariff war right now is peaking between the United States and China. But the battle casualties, if that's a word I may use, is not going to be just United States and China.
Yes, this is a high stakes game of roulette, and we are only starting to see what will unravel in the weeks that happens. To set it in perspective, manufacturing is 10% in the US, which means 10% of people in the US are gainfully employed in manufacturing. It's not easy to change this. The average wage in the US is $16. I'll give you a very small example. Even if you buy packaging in the US, it's probably 3 to 4 times as expensive if it's made in the US versus if it's made in China. Now, even if you put 100% duty on packaging, which should be the simplest thing that you can reshore back onto the US, you think packaging could be done very fast. You will still have almost a double differential in cost between the United States and places like China, which are, of course, the predominant exporters to the US. So systemically, it's not going to be easy to make this move. This is clearly a signaling mechanism. 3 or 4 things, in my opinion, are likely to happen. At the end, I think, and US has said this, they are as much focused on the deficit as they are on increasing the trade volume from many of these countries. Take the example of India. Today, while we have a trade surplus versus the US, one of the very interesting things which is now happening is that oil for the first time is below $60. Now, that's a bonanza for India, even though that may be unintended consequence. Tomorrow, India can easily start buying more oil from the US. And if we buy more oil, then the trade will get balanced. Number 2, what I'm afraid of happening, I think, is at the moment, services have not come into this. So what the US is not talking about is the fact that it has a large service surplus versus other countries. It may have a goods deficit, but it has a services surplus. So what may be possible, and you can see signs of this, there was some talk that China may ban movies from the United States. The US financial system is very strong. The US educational system is creating a lot of value in the US. So if this spills over from just manufactured goods to trade, and services, then we have something which is much, much more major. I would say a couple of weeks will take before it gets clarity. But if this does not get sorted in the next 2 to 3 months, then certainly you will see lots of turmoil around the world and possibly recession and the consequences of this, which we are already seeing. The stock market is kind of factoring in terms of its daily movements.
Okay, Kenneth Moch, how is it in the United States? I mean, in your sector, are people being cautious? Are people being skeptical at this point? Because at the end of the day, tariffs, as you said, a hike of tariffs in pharma sector is directly going to impact patients, is going to directly impact treatments in hospitals. And these are generic drugs, but there are also high stakes that are involved at this. India is saying the pharmaceutical companies in India are not going to be affected. All of this may get transferred to the buyers in United States. But for you all, how are you looking at this? Is there skepticism?
The answer is that any type of uncertainty creates problems in the drug development process. So there are 2 different things in your question. in terms of tariffs, they don't affect the developers of new medicines at this stage. But when you create uncertainty in the financial markets, people are less willing to invest in risky ventures like biotechnology drug development. So that does have an impact on the whole drug development, if you will, infrastructure and environment. I happen to be in the early stage biotech drug development, and I can see that investors such as venture capitalists are very cautious right now about their investment strategy because, as Dr. Mehta just said, we don't and they don't understand what the outcome is going to be over the next few months of this, what I would think of as a negotiation process on global tariffs. So if the idea of the Trump administration is to rebalance global manufacturing, we're going to have to wait to see what the outcome is of this multi-month process that starts with setting some new potential barriers through the tariff negotiations.
Kenneth Moch, then am I hearing this right? You're saying there's no knee-jerk reactions at this point from not just the pharma sector, but also the health sector, from hospitals. I mean, are there any concerns? Are there any knee-jerk reactions? Are there concerns over hoarding or mass accumulation? Is there any such concerns or conversations around?
Well, I'm sure there are in various parts of the sector because, of course, we're a very heterogeneous, patient population. So if it looks like certain drugs will become significantly more expensive, you might see some of the importers try to, hoard them as you describe it. But that has an economic consequence as well because they'll be paying the tariffs. That doesn't mean tariffs does not mean lack of availability. It just means higher prices. So this is not like hoarding toilet paper at the beginning of COVID when everybody thought you'd run out. This is the pharmaceutical manufacturing will continue. The prices might change as it relates to India and more of the generic or low-cost drug manufacturing. It will have an impact, but as you said at the beginning of this segment, the price increases for the more low-cost generic drugs won't be that great. It will just be over a very large number of prescriptions of drugs. For the higher cost drugs, that's hard to calculate right now. And again, this will be a negotiation process. The other side, which is the concept of rebalancing where manufacturing is done, will take years to sort out, in my opinion.
Right. Last question to you, Dharmesh Shah. So, do you see this largely as a political messaging?
Possibly, I cannot say about politics. What I know is simple pharmaceutical norms. I believe that we are all in a healthcare segment, and I've always believed with the philosophy of accessibility and affordability. And I personally believe that any government has to be cautious about its healthcare segment and healthcare bill. And US is a social security funded country. So naturally, I'm sure that, the president will have to take a suitable decision which does not harm his healthcare bill, as well as, the patients don't have to spend extra for the healthcare treatment.
All right, we'll leave it at that. Thank you very much to all of our panelists for joining us, for your perspectives. David Sofair, thank you very much for your time. Kenneth Moch, good to have you. Thank you so much. Dharmesh Shah, thank you very much for your perspectives. And Dr. Sudhir Mehta, as usual, pleasure to have you. Thank you so much for joining us. Time for a very short break. On the other side, my colleague Shreya Upadhyay takes you up with all the latest.